recording. Thank you for joining us today for our final Gender to a T of the academic year. I'm Cheryl Judasic-Wiggs. I'm co-director of the Gender Studies program here at ECU. And today we welcome Dr. Meghan Berger, who will present I Am Because We Are, Lessons Learned from Investigating Gendered Racial Microaggressions. Dr. Berger is a research and teaching fellow in the College of Education's Department of Interdisciplinary Professions Counselor Education program. So welcome everyone, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Gender Studies program, for having me. I'm excited to share my work and introduce myself to the scholarly community here at ECU. I'm going to share my screen and get started. So I am because we are. In this presentation, I will overview or introduce myself and through a researcher narrative and highlight key points in my career that have led me to where I am today. I will overview an intern project that I completed during my doctoral experience. I'll also tell you a bit about my dissertation that I completed. From both of those studies, which I completed during my doctoral experience, I'll highlight a few of the lessons learned. These lessons learned come more from culturally responsive practices when working with women of color and investigating sensitive topics in research. I'll pause for a brief Q&A and invite you all to ask questions about my research, any reflections that may have come up, and we can discuss there. And then I would like for us to close with a mindfulness activity. And with this mindfulness activity, I'm integrating the responses from my participants in my dissertation, and I use a few brain spotting techniques to guide us through that process. So I'm ready to get started. Research and narrative. Now, this is the piece where I always get a little lost in the sauce, so please excuse me, because as I think back about my experience and how I've become a counselor educator, there were a few redirections, and I too was a STEM individual, and I was, very excited about science and math growing up. And in high school, I was in Math UIL. I was on the academic decathlon team. So when I was in high school, I was a pretty nerdy individual, and I enjoyed it. It was fun. I loved science. And so coming to college and in my undergrad experience, I knew I was going to continue with that passion. As you hear me pause, that passion came to a slight, slow pause, stop. Gen Chem 1 was just not fun. So I was a biochemistry major at a PWI in Dallas, and it was a huge room, 500 students, and while I knew the concepts, somehow, some way, the concepts on the slides weren't connecting to my test performance. And so I changed majors from biochem to neuroscience because I was taking a psychology class, and in one of the topics we talked about neuroscience. I was like, wait a second, I've never really thought about studying the brain more intently. And so I still was able to fulfill this science urge and interest that I had, but in a different way that felt more comfortable, and plus it was from the guidance of my advisors at the time. My advisors were quote unquote supporting me and helping me find a career where I would be more comfortable in something that I had the ability. From then, I would like to pause to note that in my senior year, I did an internship with one of my neuroscience faculty, and he also had, so in addition to the research he was conducting, he was also a Spanish-speaking counselor. From that experience, he encouraged me to pursue counseling as a way to connect my interest in neuroscience. So I was like, okay, maybe this isn't so much of a microaggression, but the message I took from my undergrad experience was I was not a fit for STEM, and I'd be better suited for the softer sciences. Now, I went on and transitioned into pursuing my master's in clinical mental health counseling. During my experience as a graduate student, I participated in a few research studies. So first, I was a graduate research assistant that conducted a literature review on how to conduct community needs assessments. So I was working within a lower income, predominantly African-American community in New Orleans. And so this urban setting and how to conduct community needs assessments to ascertain to their truth. Within that experience, I was also invited to participate on a National Science Foundation funded grant where we were exploring African American engineering students' experiences within their education setting. So we were looking at their sense of belonging and stereotype threat vulnerability. Now, as a master's student, I wasn't quite aware of the parallel, but now as a counselor educator today in this moment, I totally see the parallels. I was going in and researching myself, and I wasn't an engineer, but it was still this idea of understanding the sense of belonging, stereotype vulnerability, and how are these high achieving students able to succeed in these spaces, and how can we better support them? I would also say that in becoming a counselor, I was also a researcher in training. Now, I wanted that experience as an undergrad, but it didn't quite happen that way. And I'm very fortunate to have the opportunities as a counselor to engage in that research training. From that experience, I came on to North Carolina and I pursued my doctoral degree at North Carolina A&T. Now, while at North Carolina A&T, I was not trying to carve out this space as a STEM counselor or STEM counselor educator, but somehow, some way, someone found out that I was on campus and invited me to join them on the study as their graduate assistant. And this time we were exploring microaggressions in engineering. So again, this idea of my parallel experience and having the opportunity to research it, but in a way that's not me researching my own personal experience. This has led me to, and of course through my counseling, counselor education training, I've brought out to culture-centered theories. And so by using a culture-centered framework, Ubuntu philosophy, so Afrocentric philosophy, I am because we are. I recognize the humanness in my experience, but also the humanness in the research that I'm conducting. I recognize the parallel process that's happening. And as a Black woman in STEM, recognize my truths, how can I create research programs or research projects to adequately understand what they're experiencing, but also promote change, promote change and promote their wellness. And I briefly spoke about microaggressions, but I always like to include a slide just to let you know how I speak of microaggressions. So scholars have defined microaggressions as the ill-meaning verbal or nonverbal interactions directed towards an individual because of their race, sexuality, class. I'm going to continue on and say any identity that a person may hold, so that their religion, their ability status, and even their geographical location. Scholars have separated and found ways to categorize microaggressions in 3 different forms. Microinvalidations are the instances where these negative experiences and feelings of the person of color, the minority individual in that setting, are refuted and denied. So they are kind of pushed aside like, oh, that's not really happening, or the myth of meritocracy. So it's like, no, you've got to pull up your bootstraps and work really hard. Whereas, as I kind of pointed out at the PWI setting, I didn't have as many opportunities to be that researcher I wanted to. Whereas at the HBCU setting, as a Black woman, female scholar, I did have those opportunities. Microassaults, the overt demeaning actions, including avoidant behaviors. So I would say, in hearing my story, thinking about when the advisors, now granted, they weren't being mean, but the faculty were not saying, oh, come on, we see that you're trying. It was just, oh, you're not a good fit for STEM. So whether their actions were, whether it was verbal or nonverbal, it was still this kind of communication where you're not included in this. And then micro insults. These are the offensive behavior that belittles an underrepresented minority person's cultural identity. So thinking about, now I could perceive my senior internship to kind of be a microaggression, whereas it's like, oh, I could have worked with you on the research side, but instead you saw me as a better fit for a counselor. Hindsight, becoming a counselor has created more opportunities for me. But say for instance, I did not perceive it in that way, and I perceived this to be negative, and I still am not not great scholar, not adequate, not competent. So it's really easy to how, slight and, sometimes well-intentioned or, not even consciously aware, these microaggressions and interactions can perpetuate messages to individuals that impact their wellness, well-being, and ability to stay in given environments and succeed. So I want to pause here because I did not give a nice transition to all of the other studies that I did in my doctoral experience. So I'm going to pause here. As a graduate research assistant during my doctoral experience, the study that we did, it was looking at HBCUs, so historically Black colleges and universities, and PWIs, predominantly white institutions. From that study, we discovered that microaggressions were prevalent at both institutions. However, at the predominantly white institutions, microaggressions happen at a higher rate. But also from looking at the studies, we interviewed Asian female and male, Black female and male, um, Latino students, and white female and male students. And from looking at those broad, and I know that we did not include, and that was something that if I were the PI, I probably would have done a little bit better looking at the subgroups within the various ethnicities, because we did not include indigenous peoples. Sorry for that aside. But from that research, I was inspired to look more at how women of color are navigating microaggressions. With that, being on that research grant, there was an opportunity for me to submit an award to conduct my own study. And so with doing that, I found this as an opportunity to reconnect neuroscience, counseling, and microaggressions all together to see what could I do, what could I come up with, and how could I use my skills as a counselor and my knowledge experiencing microaggressions to help others and empower other women to share their stories and how they may overcome. So my intern project was using brain spotting therapy to overcome microaggressions. It was a participatory intervention study with Black women in STEM. Now, when I was recruiting for the study, I did want to recruit women of color from various backgrounds, but just the way that my recruitment and the pandemic was going, I was able to recruit 4 or 5 Black women. I would say that this is a pre-experimental mixed methods design simply because now you all may be wondering, what's brain spotting therapy? And we'll talk about it in just a bit, but brain spotting is a newer modality that does not have as much research out there. And the research that is existing, it's compared to eye movement desensitization research, reprocessing therapy. And essentially these are somatic and fixed eye positions that we're using to conduct therapy. Problem is, one, it's newer, so there's not a lot of research. Two, it's not been documented, or there's little evidence to be, to understand how it's used within communities of color. So back to the study. I used a pre-screening survey to assess whether these participants did in fact experience microaggressions and whether they perceive themselves to experience traumatic stress. The microaggressions I used, just for the sake of the study, I used the modified version of both scales. So I wanted to know, were you experiencing assumptions about your intelligence or your ability? Did you experience sexual objectification? Did you feel like you were the only one in your space? And have you felt silenced or marginalized? The reason I chose those microaggressions was because those were the most popular microaggressions from the study that we conducted. I also included a race-based traumatic stress scale because recognizing that microaggressions are impacting a person's well-being, the context is race-based, the race aspect of it, because it's like you have all of these varying identities which are impacting a person's, we have all of these varying identities, and when you have these microaggressions, they impact all of the identities, but it seems as though because race, ethnicity is the first thing that a person encounters, that seems to be the greater stress inducer. Now, this is just based on my research and kind of what I've seen, and also recognizing that intersectionality theory does not speak about traumatic stress. So I needed a theory that specifically spoke about traumatic stress symptoms. The symptoms that they most likely included or most likely would experience would be this avoidance or running away from the setting, depressed or sad feelings, re-experiencing, so constantly having flashbacks or constantly thinking that this one experience is just like the negative experience that they had in the lab weeks ago. And then also somatic symptoms or body ailments. So that's like headaches, migraines, stomach aches, general fatigue, and things like that. So I would like to note that all the participants did experience microaggressions, and they did in some level experience traumatic stress symptoms. With this intervention, so once they completed the pre-screening survey, I did a focus group before and after. So the pre-focus group was to operationalize this idea of microaggressions recovery. It was also to introduce microaggressions therapy to the group and to, just double check, is this really what you all would like to sign up for? Once they, kind of went through this focus group orientation, then I conducted 3 individual sessions with each of the participants. After the 3 sessions, I invited everyone back for another focus group to, assess how do they feel about brain spotting therapy and where can we take this intervention next. Given the fact that I recognize that some people may feel, oh, let's tell the researcher who's doing all of this work that she did a great job, I also included a post-intervention satisfaction survey so that they can, give their more transparent feelings about the intervention. So the pre-intervention focus group are in blue and the post are in green. So when I asked the participants why they joined, one of the participants shared, I don't think that there's a way to necessarily recover from microaggressions, but I think there's a way to deal with them. And with this, you're going to teach us how? Question mark. That was a very a very daunting question because I'm like, oh snap, I came into this research really selfish. I wanted to know if brain spotting therapy would be an effective treatment. I didn't think about how they may actually need to be taught how to be recovered over it. And I was just hoping that the therapy would do so. So we'll get to that in just a bit. Another participant shared, microaggressions and being a woman of color in STEM, they go hand in hand. I went to a PWI for undergrad and for my master's. And yeah, I was like, I need to do this. And so for this participant, I did not collect any, did not do any data collection during their brain spotting processing because I felt like that was going to be too personal. But I will comment that this particular participant, in the focus group, she identified several microaggressions, but during her processing, she had a lot of layered circumstances, and it was as though we were processing things that were happening during the week. So she actually needed like ongoing care. And while she did have a therapist that she worked with, this study, it opened up some things, and it was a note to be mindful about doing research in this way. Now for their thoughts following an intervention. And I started to allude to this, and I'm happy that this focus group, they just explicitly said it for me. So one participant, she said, for me, I think there needed to be more sessions because brain spotting takes some time getting used to. And you just know, and just know for me, channeling into my own thoughts and emotions is sometimes a bit time consuming. And then that other participant, I'll definitely agree with Requiem. I think the thing does I think that the thing does make it difficult is that I guess, well, with just how I was raised and going through these spaces, there's not really time to just really sit down and reflect emotionally. You're always in a process of got to keep it going, moving from one thing to the next thing. So I'm glad that these participants felt comfortable being authentic in this moment to one, say that they needed more time, but then two, to really share and shine a light on how it's really hard to navigate these spaces and to ask in a study to explore their emotions. One, needing more time and more space for that, but also allowing for just given that their environments that they're always in. And so if this is the only safe space that they can process their emotions, it's going to take some time. And there's a need to be intentional about cultivating that space. Here are some more results from the focus group discussion. I recognize that brain spotting is effective, though the goals were unclear and more time was needed. So when I say the goals were unclear, microaggressions recovery is like asking how to make the sky blue. How do we recover over these ill-meaning, either intentional or unintentional circumstances or interactions that we're having, and without stopping the other person from aggressing? So how can we resolve microaggressions within ourselves? And it was thinking of ways to if I were to do this again, cultivate it in a way that, one, allotted for more time and to be specific with the goals. Additionally, the participants outlined or suggested needing coping strategies and resources for their support as they're emotionally exploring. So it wasn't that the study was uncomfortable to talk about the microaggressions. The study was uncomfortable because it was uncomfortable talking about their emotions. And the research discussion also led to anticipate at least 5 brain spotting sessions for processing emotions related to microaggressions. So the first, it seems like the three sessions that we had was just an opportunity to open up about the microaggressions, but more space was needed to process their emotions. And this was evident in the post-intervention survey. One participant out of the 5 indicated that they did not agree that brain spotting helped with their emotions. All participants, though, agreed that brain spotting helped them mentally process the microaggressions. As a result, they also agreed that they do not feel so reactive to the microaggressions that they've experienced in STEM settings. Each respondent would participate with brain spotting therapy again. So again, this is highlighting that the brain spotting therapy was effective in mentally processing and just kind of understanding the whole situation and all of the factors, but the feelings, the anger, the vulnerability, the frustration, needing more space to process that, and which completely makes sense because if we recognize how we may experience sadness in other areas and how that sadness may be connected to the microaggressions, you need space to process that. And so from the intern project, here are a few of my researcher insights. I learned to be adaptive to participants' needs, especially when conducting participatory clinical intervention studies. And I also learned to be responsive to my own needs as a researcher when working during a pandemic. Though the study did ascertain, they get to what I wanted. The goal was to understand whether or not brain spotting would be effective for microaggressions recovery. The actual details to the process was a little challenging. And one, because I was going through, COVID-19 pandemic, and I was a doctoral student navigating that and my dissertation. Microaggressions impact individuals' perceptions of self, emotional expression, and capacity for relationship building. This is important for researchers to recognize because recognizing that the individual, when they're coming to you, may or may not have a whole sense of self. They may not have, they may be well and they may have a strong personal identity, but they may also have ways in which their self-esteem may have been impacted. Furthermore, their emotional processing, they may be, more repressed or more closed off in their emotions. And then also there's this ability or recognizing that relation building is impacted with microaggressions. It's, do I trust individuals to tell them about my story? And with me being a researcher and I'm not their therapist, would they feel comfortable telling this new person about all of these circumstances? And that's something to keep in mind. Cultural context, identity, and level of acculturation inform how microaggressions stress a person's wellness and break down their self-concept. Researchers may account for those factors along with the emotional effects of microaggressions when conducting research. So essentially all of that to say, you can't just come in and want to explore microaggressions. There has to be intentionality. And even though I attempted to create space by doing the focus group beforehand and the focus group afterwards, there was still space where I could have done more relational development. Next, I would like to tell you all about my dissertation that I completed. Sorry, I was just double checking on time. And so with my dissertation, I took it from a different perspective. Instead of exploring the client's perceptions of brain spotting, I was curious about the clinician's experiences with brain spotting. Again, I used a race-based traumatic stress theory, and I integrated an Afrocentric paradigm. And going back to the Ubuntu I am because we are, recognizing all of the parallels informed the therapeutic framework. My research question, what are the shared lived experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color licensed brain spotting practitioners? The data sources I used a mini focus group and an individual interview, as well as group process observation. So I recorded the session. We went through and I encourage everyone to unmute because I wanted to gather the that were taking place during the conversation. It was a really enriching and rewarding experience. And I see in the comment that someone really likes the graphic. This graphic was so exciting. This was our icebreaker activity, and it's Spoiler alert, we're going to do something similar towards the end. But for 10 minutes, we listened to a soundtrack on a brain spotting album, and I invited the participants to share brain spotting is. And they filled in and they, either just verbally said it or said it in the chat. And it was like amazing in the client's voice, but not just amazing. They were hearing their clients say amazing while we were processing. It was beautiful. Giving yourself permission to heal, life-changing, special sauce, subcortical, spiritual enrichment, heart chakra, highly attuning. And so these words came up not only in the very beginning, but it foreshadowed how the focus group session was going to go. I came up with 3 main themes from the study. Brain spotting is a client-led process that uses liberatory counseling practices and a brain-based intervention for addressing race-based traumatic stress. I can go into a little bit more detail about that and actually, I'll do it now because I'm like, I can talk about it here. So the liberatory counseling practices. I'm recognizing my audience, and some of you all may not be mental health specialists or mental health professionals, but brain spotting practitioners are shaking up the way that they do therapy. So rather than leaning into the DSM diagnoses, so like bipolar disorder or adjustment disorder, they're really working with their clients from a framework of dysregulation to regulation. And they're also inviting their clients to be very transparent and open with the process. So they're based on what their clients are discussing, so their clients' feedback during session, that's the indicator to let them know how well sessions are going. Rather, in a more traditional counseling sense, counselors may use assessments and pen and paper assessments along the way. And while that is a very systematic protocol to understanding whether or not there's change, the brain spotting therapist find that there's more authenticity in seeing whether or not their clients, let me just give an example because I'm talking around it. So for instance, a client will come in and say, oh, I'm needing to process some relational issues. And in this one example that a participant shared, they said that they knew that their clients were well because their clients would cut off their hair and come in and saying, I'm free. So they'd cut off their hair and come to session, I'm free. I feel so much better. I'm lighter. All of the stuff that I was worried about before, it's not an issue. And so while that's not an evidence-based way of knowing whether a client is well, it's a pretty visible indicator that they're enjoying the session and that they've overcome the challenges that they've had. So I would say 5 lessons learned over the course of my master's and doctoral experience, as well as the 2 studies I completed during my doctoral experience. Problem-solving capabilities are enhanced through interdisciplinary research projects. So both in my master's and in my doctoral studies, those NSF projects included sociologists, counselors, engineering educators. I'm trying to think. There was another psychology. So all of these different now they may seem like there's some there's some difficulty. I'm sorry. There's more that can be accomplished when the great minds come together. Also, making space for humility in a research process. Even though I said before that I came in with my own agenda, wanting to see if brain spotting would be effective, I still allowed for humility by opening up the space for the focus group in the beginning, so that the idea of asking my participants to help me operationalize microaggressions recovery included them in the research process. Also, I was a doc student and I'm freshly out. I'm recognizing that there was space to grow and space to learn. So telling my participants that up front and then asking them, are you still okay with participating? Is this what you signed up for? And being okay with how they respond. And fortunately for me, my participants were really eager to continue, but it also allowed them to feel safe enough to say, hey, brain spotting didn't work for me because those emotions were intense. Also learn the value of researcher reflexivity and self-care. In pursuing my training in brain spotting therapy, I underwent I experienced a brain spotting therapy as I was training. So I was able to feel all of the sensations that my participants in the intern project were talking about. So, I did let them know, it's like, hey, there may be a chance you may just like burst out crying out of nowhere. Not saying that I'm setting this up for you to cry out of nowhere, but that's just kind of how, our body layers the emotions. And so because I underwent this process before and I reflected about it, I was able to use that knowledge and include it in the focus group. Also, I recognize self-care. I definitely could have pushed for more participants and more data, but again, it was a pandemic. I did 2 studies during my doctoral experience. There was always an opportunity for more. I also learned that knowledge is gained from co-constructed truths. While yes, I parallel some of those experiences that my participants shared, it was not the same. And so I needed my own experience and their own experience to come together to understand how we can promote this change and how this phenomenon we're both experiencing is impacting our lives, and how we can use this knowledge to promote change and greater than where we are today. And then also, I kind of alluded to this. This is only the beginning. I'm really excited about the work that I've done, and also the pilot studies and how it's set me up to launch in different ways. So I could see where another pilot study or doing this on a greater scale to get more research about brain spotting therapy. Now, I would like to open the floor for maybe like 10, 15 minutes of questions, if that's okay.
Sure. Does anybody have any questions?
Um, that was really interesting. And I just wanted to ask if you could tell us a little bit about brain spotting therapy and exactly what it is, because I've never heard of it before.
Yes, yes. Brain spotting therapy is they call it a bottom up processing therapy. So, traditional counseling uses talk therapy, so speaking, to process either emotionally held memories, trauma, or, counseling also does performance enhancement and things like that. So, with brain spotting therapy, it engages a person's eye location and their body sense as they're processing a given story. So a therapist would, invite them to share what are they coming in for, what are they wanting to process, and then as they tell that story, the therapist invites them to hone into their felt senses, and then from there, we work together to find where that sense is most felt in the body. I feel like there's more I want to say about brain spotting. Going back to my dissertation, the idea of it being a client-led process and the liberatory aspects of it, the fact that we're not labeling our clients' experiences, we're just seeing it from the human condition. I say we because I am a brain spotting therapist as well by facto of the research and practicing. And we don't label the individual's experience. So we won't say, oh, it sounds like you're dealing with anxiety right now. Here's a quick fix. It's let's listen to this human condition. Let's understand how this story connects to another story, connects to another story, and how that all is present for you in the foreground to process. Thank you.
What does a typical session look like?
A typical session can look like, um, hmm, it could be at any time span. So I've seen sessions as short as 30 minutes, and I've seen sessions as long as 4 hours.
Mhm.
No, there was like 6 hours in there. It includes a little bit of talking at the beginning. So the therapist may ask a few questions to understand the story. Then, once we have an understanding of the story, or it seems like the client's ready to process, then the therapist will either use a pointer, and I don't have my pointer with me today, a pointer, or use the visual space and invite the client to work together to find where they would like to stare at for a space for a moment of time. And so throughout the session, the client will be staring at either 1 or 2 points. And I don't want to say 1 or 2 points because I've also seen a session where a client has, using like the tiles on the ceiling, they've looked at each intersection. And so the multiple points that they were looking at. During that point and like staring process, the client may choose to speak out loud, or they may be processing on the inside. So it becomes a mindfulness session. Once the therapist perceives, based on some attunement, that the client has processed or has reached a point where they're able to stop the session, then the session is stopped. I would say that from my experience and from what I've heard from other clinicians, they say that they spend less time in session with their less like sessions overall with their clients. So a person may come in to process for whatever reason sexual trauma is coming up, or sexual trauma, or say just a car accident or whatever's coming up for them. It won't take them as long to overcome. I hope that answers your question and gives you a little bit more about what to expect.
Yeah, it does. I was wondering if is it like kind of like hypnotherapy if you're looking at a spot or
Sure, we can say it's like hypnotherapy.
okay.
I haven't used that word before, and I don't think I've heard it, but I would, in hearing you, yes, I would say it's
Okay.
like hypnotherapy. Yes.
Okay.
So when you look, hi, when you look at a particular place, it's associated with a point in your brain. So if you look to top left, that's significant. Whereas if you look to the top right, there's a difference in how you're processing, or you're
Yes,
locating
it's
in your brain where what part of your brain that experience is being stored.
similar, kind of. So it's not as clear cut as this eye point I'm looking at right here connects to the subcortical region right here. It's more so this eye point is correlated to this point in my brain, as well as this felt sense in my body, as well as the stored memory.
Wow. How did it get mapped out?
And that's the beautiful thing. And that's where I would like for my research to continue on. And like I said, brain spotting is very new. So there's some literature out there. So if you're curious about how this mapping is done, EMDR is where brain spotting is born out of. So there's more research in EMDR that speaks about how the pathways are used. But again, what we're learning in neuroscience is that it's not as this piece and this piece connect together. It's the pathway, that a cascade of events that are going on. And so I'm hoping that, someday I would get to research that. Thank you, Sue, for your question. That was a really great question. And I think that's another reason why I'm like, I want to do more research on this, because how do we know this is working? Because I feel it and it's working, but it's like, where's the science behind this?
Mhm.
Hi, I have a question. So I know you're kind of gearing this towards like either clients or clinicians of this practice, but do you see on maybe like a smaller or less formal scale sort of any applications that would be beneficial within an educational environment or somewhere more social or casual?
Absolutely, absolutely. So over this past year, I'm teaching career counseling this semester, and I invited students to join me in a neurocognition science lab over in Rivers to do a career assessment and then process their feelings on becoming a counselor. So I could see where this could be helpful for career development. I could also see my first training that I did with brain spotting. So I'm trained in brain spotting phases one, phases two, and in group. In phase one, I completed, that group was with clergy people and individuals working in religious spaces. So there were yoga instructors, there were chiropractors, um, there was a reverend. And so I could see this also being used in the spiritual space, because if you think about some of the imagery and symbols that are used in religious spaces, those could also be used for enlightenment and processing. And David Grant, so I didn't even say David Grant's name. David Grant is the founder of Brain Spotting, and in his book that he's written, he tells various client stories where he's worked with individuals using brain spotting. One of his clients was a 16-year-old figure skater wanting to do sports performance to overcome one of the jumps that she did. I think brain spotting can be literally used anywhere. And I think that's the other caveat about brain spotting. It's like, so who is qualified then to deliver brain spotting? So yes, and more to look into. Thank you for your question, Stephanie.
Thank you.
So the training that you went through and are going through and are developing, which is all great. So is there a danger to the client if because you were saying that the counselor is, although it's self-directed, the counselor is the guide, right? Am I getting that correct?
It's self-directed. I would say the therapist is the facilitator, not the guide.
Facilitator, okay.
And I'm going to pull up another. Here we go. Tail of the comet. So tail of the comet is a phrase that we hear a lot during the training setting, and just brain spotting therapists use it all the time. And it reminds us to follow the client's processing. So and that's why I was like, ooh, did I do something with the study when I came in wanting to look at microaggressions recovery? So because I prompted them, did I stay in the tail of the comet? I'm not certain. But as a brain spotting therapist, individuals come to therapy knowing not necessarily knowing what they're going to get into with brain spotting, but knowing that they want to process a certain something. So is there danger? There's always an emotional risk in counseling. I would say that with brain spotting, the therapist is trained to watch whether an individual is kind of going outside of this window of tolerance. So whether a person is still able to maintain without opening, for lack of better terms, can of worms. And so if the person is seeming more and more distressed, the brain spotting therapist would guide them into a different technique that would help them still process, but from a different angle. So there's a way to process the negative emotions, and there's a way to process the positive emotions around the circumstance.
Excellent. Thank you. You answered a question I couldn't put into words. So that was exactly what I wanted. Is there a danger of going, being led astray by the counselor or going off track and creating more damage to oneself? But yes, excellent. Okay.
And I can share a little bit about from my own personal experience. I did mention self-care. So my therapist is also a brain spotting therapist, and she's a great one, but oh my goodness, she was having a week, and her phone was going and it was buzzing on the side, and she was trying to maintain eye contact, but I could so tell that she wasn't as attuned. And so if there's a danger, it would be a danger in not being attuned to the group or being attuned to the person you're working with. So being distracted, because brain spotting is the strength is in the relationship. That's the unspoken relationship between the client and the therapist. And so if there's any moment, and so for my own, just another bit of transparency, relational trauma. So because relationships are a sensitive spot for me, anytime something like that kind of kicks up, there's a chance that I may not feel well after the session. So for her, for that instance, it didn't, I wouldn't say it didn't damage me, but I did notice that she wasn't as attuned. I could see, I'm trying to think of another instance when I've had an individual intensely cry. But even with the intense cries, it's this idea of it's being cathartic and releasing. So while it may be scary to process it because of just the nature of what the topic is, that part may be challenging, but I would say that once the person trusts themselves to fully emotionally respond and emote, if you will, then the scary part isn't there anymore. They overcome it.
Following a session, what are or I guess, how do I want to phrase this? Is there sort of a typical sort of like not a follow-up, but I'm sorry. I spoke before I had fully formed my question. What are the sort of like next steps like following a session? Like, so when you finish this session, and is there sort of like a buffer before the client kind of goes out into the world, or is there sort of like self homework, or what does that follow-up look like after a session, I guess?
Yes. So I'm speaking right now from my clinical hat, my clinical experience. For me, now every therapist does theirs a little different. So my therapist, she'll process for 30 minutes and then will speak for the last 20 minutes and process and see like, oh, I heard you say this. What did that mean for you? And I'll talk about it a little bit more and maybe I'll self-guide myself to some homework. When I'm in session, I like to invite my client to process a little bit longer. So we'll process, and my sessions are a little bit longer as well. I like to have hour and 30-minute sessions. So the individual may process for 45 minutes, but then I would guide them through either a sound bowl, a sensory activity. So if there's like, if they have lotion nearby, something tactile, something soft, depending on what they process. So if they I had a client processing, she was wanting to become an entrepreneur. So for her, I was like, okay, well, you've got to stand up now. You got to stand up and you've got to dance it and you've got to like really embody it and feel big. And so with another client, she was feeling, she was saying, this sense of needing rest. And so I invited her to invite things into her space that would, signify rest for her. So it just depends on what the client needs and also depends on the style of the therapist. I also mentioned that brain spotting can go on for like hours. And so that would look more so like a workshop where the therapist would be intentional about facilitating that space. And I think if we're okay, intentional about facilitating that space, I would like to move us forward into our closing activity.
Sure.
So here are my references and the closing exercise. So my participants for my dissertation, the practitioners of color, they close our focus groups by sharing different sayings, how they felt connected to brain spotting. So first, I'm going to read the 4 prayers and the 4 comments that they left, and then I'm going to play a mindfulness track and then guide us through to our I position. So first, at the end of hardship comes happiness. I lift my eyes up to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Psalms 121, verses 1 and 2. Dearest Odisa, turn my confusion into clarity, my can'ts into cans, my trials into triumphs, my burdens into blessings, my hurdles into happiness. For you are the roots to my trust, so I need not fear any coming storm. Ashe. Stand tall and be proud. Go out on a limb. Reach for the sky, branch out. Stay grounded. Remember your roots. Drink plenty of water. Get rid of dead wood. Be confident. Never stop growing. Bend before you break. Turn over a new leaf and enjoy the view. So in this moment, please close your eyes and I will turn on the track for us to listen to. Now that you've taken a moment to settle through, I'm going to read the prayers one more time. But once I read the sayings once again, we'll open our eyes and then locate position. At the end of hardship comes happiness. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Dearest Odisha, turn my confusion into clarity, my can'ts into cans, my trials into triumphs, my burdens into blessings, my hurdles into happiness. For you are the roots to my trust, so I need not fear any coming storm. I share. Stand tall and be proud. Go out on a limb. Reach for the sky, branch out, stay grounded. Remember your roots. Drink plenty of water. Get rid of dead wood. Be confident. Never stop growing. Bend before you break. Turn over new leaf and enjoy the view. And so when hearing those sayings, I'm curious and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see the chat. And so when hearing those statements, I'm curious if there's a felt sense in your body where something maybe resonated for you. Allow yourselves to connect to that felt sense right now. For me, I feel it in my core. If you'd like, you can be in the chat and share where you feel this sensation. Or if you would like to stay attuned, and it's okay. But once you've connected to your body sounds, allow yourself to look to your left for a moment, to the center for a moment, and then to the right for a moment. One of those spaces may have held a stronger body sensation for you. And so for me, it's to my left. So I'm going to look to my left and find a spot on the left-hand side that I'd like to process now connected to that felt sense.
Not to break the spell, but is there a place that we can find the music online where it's not coming terribly clear, but it's beautiful?
On Apple Music,
Mhm.
actually, I'm looking
Nice, thank you.
here. Yeah. So, of course, a brain spotting session would be a lot longer. I would have an ability to better attune with you all and not be thinking about my research. But if you don't mind, I want to show you what I was processing and looking at. So just give me just a second.
Okay.
So, hopefully you all can see this and I won't have too bad of a glare. Okay, it's an awful glare. Oh, here we go. So this is an image. I'm originally from New Orleans, and this was drawn by a high school student. And for me, I was processing on this tree right here. And so with my roots in New Orleans, it felt really comforting to process at that intersection there. So in a clinical setting, clients may or therapists may have things on their wall for their clients to process with, or they also may be invited to process with things they see in their space, just like I did. So yeah, thank you all so much. Did you all have any closing words that you wanted to share?
This was absolutely fascinating.
Thank
Good
you.
job, Dr. Berger. This is Lonnie. I actually, while meditating, I saw a lizard, so I just jumped and ran back in. But I love, this was a great way to spend, the middle of the day. It's so I learned something else from you each time I hear you speak.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for
Yeah, that was
for
great.
being on part of Gender to a T. This is and it's a wonderful way to end the academic year as well. So thank you so much, and it's nice
Yay.
meeting you. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I appreciate y'all's time. Thank you so much. It was really exciting to share this work and to know that, all of that time spent last year during the dissertation, it was well worth it because the
Sure,
reward in this work is so beautiful.
you
I
did
love
a
how
terrific job.
I love how you have to acknowledge your participation and that you bring you to the situation so that it's not always somebody is the receiver of healing and the healer, but more that you both do.
Yes.
I
yes,
love that.
Yes. One of my themes, I didn't go into it, but one of the sub themes was mutually beneficial attunement. So this idea of having to share that. Yes.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all so very much, and I hope you have a great rest of your week, and we will see you soon.
Be well.
Thank you. Bye.